Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Beyond AI Answers, Improving Strategic Thinking for Innovation Teams. My name is Greg Shotland, and I'm CEO of Lux Research. I'll be moderating and presenting during today's session alongside my colleagues Anthony Schiavo, Senior Director and Principal Analyst for Lux, and Ryan Faber, who is the AI Innovation Leader here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type in any questions you may have in the question box on your screen. Time permitting, we will answer the questions that we can. If you have questions that don't get answered, please don't hesitate to email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. If at any point you experience any type of technical difficulty, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser or disconnect and log back in, and make sure you have a strong internet connection. Okay, with that said, let us jump into the presentation, and I will hand it over to Anthony.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Ryan, for joining me today. We'll be hearing more from them during the Q&A session. But yeah, today I want to talk about how you can improve strategic thinking and really go beyond using AI and large language models in more basic ways, right? And really get into something that's a bit more advanced. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end about how here at Lux, we're also leveraging AI and how that fits within the way innovation teams can use it. So we'll start with, I think everyone knows at this point, everyone is using AI, right? Global organizational adoption of LLMs has topped 80%. Probably this year it's 90% or even more. And this is something I hear very consistently from clients. They have access to these tools now, these large language models. But just leveraging AI is not a solution to every problem, right? Last year, we ran our innovator survey and we asked innovation teams about AI, and they had some concerns. Of course, security is a big one, but then concerns around losing skill. You know, if we just ask the AI to make all our decisions for us, are we going to lose skill? Concerns about, hey, how do we actually implement this, right? How do we use this most effectively? And concerns about bad data, right? If the AI is using incorrect data to make decisions or to even make recommendations, is that going to screw us up? So we're going to be talking about all these challenges today, and part of this webinar will be challenges. And I think in particular, it's clear that innovation teams have an information management problem. When it comes to AI, you know, they are concerned about not understanding the information that's being used in those AI systems. We see this in some of the quotes from our survey. And also, there's a challenge of just the amount of data and the amount of information that's out there, right? There's this huge amount of information. How do we sort through it all? You know, AI seems like a powerful tool to help us do that, but how do we make sure it has the right information? So what actually happens when you ask a large language model a question? Well, first, you have your prompt. There's also some system prompt, some built-in prompting that gets sent to the LLM. And while the LLM is generating your answer, it's probably reasoning. So it's actually generating more text than what it's showing you and using that as a kind of facsimile of thinking. And it relies on sources, right? So here we've asked it a question about PFAS removal technologies, and it relied on a web search, right? But this creates two problems. The first is that there's often a lot of missing context. You know, public sources, the things that an LLM can access through a web search, are often biased or incomplete, right? And this can really limit the utility of large language models for analysis. You know, what you're going to find on a company's website is always going to be very positive, right? And in addition, there's a problem of style, right? These public sources, they have this sort of biased tone and style, and LLMs draw on those sources to really shape and inform the way that they respond to your questions, right? We've seen this emerge as a sort of problem of LLMs being sycophantic, right? They just want to please their users. And so they tend to give positive responses because algorithmically that's most likely to please people. So we need to think about how can we address these concerns we described around data security, around skill around implementation, while at the same time giving LLMs context and style in order to level up their responses. Okay, so let's talk about how we can actually do that and get a little bit beyond just asking AI questions. We have a kind of a basic framework that we use to think about AI use cases. Down here in the bottom left, we have things that are relatively easy to do and also quite established in terms of how you can do them. These are tasks that we think you can automate pretty straightforwardly with AI, and they're relatively routine and repeatable. You don't need a ton of human insight or human oversight. Not a lot of guessing and checking and making sure the answer is really right. You can kind of trust the AI to do these things. And then you have questions that are relatively established. There's pretty clear methodologies, right? But they're hard. The answers might be difficult to get to. They might be complex. They might require some, real human reasoning to actually be successful. Here, we think about leveraging AI to scale expertise, right? So you can use an AI to build an approach or to build an answer, to build a solution, and then you have some kind of expert review. Down in the bottom right, we have new things. Hey, can we generate new ideas? Can we tackle new problems? Can we solve new challenges, right? But not particularly difficult new challenges, right? Could just be coming up with ideas or, not, steering the whole ship of our business, but just giving us some good ideas to tackle small challenges. Here, we like to leverage AI to generate options. This is sort of a draft and explore place. It's low stakes, and we're going to leverage AI to improve our ideation. And then lastly, we have problems that are both hard and new, right? And this is where human creativity is really critical and human expertise, right? And so this is where we think the AI systems should mostly be avoided, right? Evaluating an investment decision, right? It's quite a big, complex, and meaty task, especially when you're talking about a new technology. And that's where you want your experts to really be freed up to think about these types of big challenges. So in an innovation context, we're going to look at 3 examples across these 3 areas that we've sort of highlighted as good opportunities for AI: curating data sources, brainstorming, and modeling and forecasting. And the goal here is really talk about not just how do we do these things with LLMs, but how do we get past sort of the most basic implementation of using a large language model. So starting with curating data sources, as I mentioned, innovation teams have a ton of information, news and big general sort of economic news, but also industry-specific news. There's academic journals, there's funding, patents, all this information. And most innovation leaders I talk to acknowledge, they do some amount of scanning in these news sources, but they all mostly acknowledge there's probably more that they could be doing, or that there's pieces of information that they're missing because there's just so much. Now, you can have your LLMs analyze news sources one by one. You can just give it an article and say, hey, I want you to score this or rank this in terms of its relevance to me or in terms of how impactful you think it's going to be. And that works. AI will give you a pretty well-reasoned answer, especially if you can provide it the right context. But obviously, this is slow, right? You don't want to spend all day sitting in front of your agent, sitting in front of your LLM, talking to it. It's not really a good use of your time, especially for something like the news. So what instead you can do, and what we've even started doing at Lux, is using LLMs to programmatically curate news and other data sources. So there are a lot of more programmatically available data sources out there. Most news websites have what's known as an RSS feed. That's I believe a real simple feed. It's machine readable, right? You have patent databases where they have API plugins or other machine readable forms. VC funding that can be gotten from databases, that can be gotten again from news headlines. There are all these ways to identify these sort of programmatically available information flows. And LLMs are really great at writing code, right? They're really great at interacting with these machine systems. So it's quite straightforward to either develop a program yourself or find a program that can allow you to download and curate these data sources, right? From the news you read already or the funding databases you already have access to. I think for a lot of teams, innovation teams, they don't really have a lot of in-house programming expertise. Maybe some of them do. Maybe there's one person, right, who has a programming background. But now with large language models, the level of difficulty of accessing this type of information programmatically has really been reduced. So you can build the code to actually do this. And then what's powerful is when you're interacting with the LLM, you can send it information not through that text chat box, but actually through a API, a machine-to-machine interface. And the major LLMs all have this. Certainly, OpenAI does. And what's nice about these LLM APIs is that they allow for very consistent control of structure and response. You can actually send an LLM a Excel spreadsheet, maybe full of news headlines or any other data that you have on a consistent basis. And you can structure its response in any format you'd like. You can control, hey, give me a spreadsheet as a response, and you can actually program in exactly what the columns and what types of responses should go in each area. And so that level of programmatic control is actually a lot more powerful than what you're able to do just via typing into the chat box. And then once you've done this, you can then automate these with simple built-in tools. Windows has a lot of task automation capabilities just baked into the operating system that allow it to, for example, run a simple program every day to pull news headlines or fire off a program to curate information from an LLM. So just within the basic framework of your laptop and access to a large language model, you can begin to programmatically curate news and other data sources. And again, this is something we've started to do at Lux. And once you've got these, next thing is let's move on to the brainstorming example. Again, LLMs are good at brainstorming, right? You can ask an LLM for an idea and it'll always come back and respond to you, which is nice. I think if you ever sent out an email asking for ideas to your colleagues, you know that getting a response is often one of the hardest parts. But again, this is simple and easy, but it's really one-off ideas, right? And in many businesses, I think a lot of the good ideas are pretty well understood or sort of have already been explored. So what the LLM needs is more context, right? And luckily, we have just developed that context, right? If we've done our news sources and our programmatic analysis of information, we're starting to build databases of whether it's relevant patents or academic journals or news to feed into our large language models. And if we have that and we have some business context, goals, your teams, the things you're working on already, just even the sort of annual reports of your own business, you can feed all that into an LLM with a structured sort of brainstorming prompt. There's a number of good brainstorming approaches that I think are a nice fit for LLMs. Things like Scamper, where you're sort of taking an existing idea and changing one element at a time to try and generate new ideas. LLMs can follow those types of prompts pretty straightforwardly. And again, you can send these ideas, these data, this context programmatically through an API. And again, you can produce a consistent output, right? In terms of the structure, in terms of the tone, the style, the quality, all of that can be structured. And similarly, we can automate this, right? We don't have to do this when we do our brainstorming exercises, but throughout the year, we can be pulling this information, identifying news stories of interest, identifying interesting pieces of technology, and sending them to the LLM for brainstorming. And then when we actually sit down and do that session, whether it's every 6 months or every year or on some other cadence, we'll have a pool of ideas um, with context that we can begin as a jumping off point for the brainstorming approach. And then looking at our last example in terms of modeling and forecasting, here there are some very established basic approaches for modeling, and LLMs know them already, and they're quite good at them. But what you'll quickly find if you try to build a model with an LLM is that LLMs really lack the specific knowledge or details necessary to actually build a working or a functioning model. Right? That's not within their existing context. That's not really within their existing capabilities. So while they can build you the skeleton of a model, they don't necessarily have all that information to actually build a useful working ballpark model. So gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we had developed that information context, and also we had a bunch of ideas which we'd like to model. And of course, in this example, we do, right? We have been building those curated news stories, those data sources. Academic journals I found are particularly good for this because they tend to get into more of the meat and potatoes of actually how the technology works. And we have brainstormed ideas that are sort of leveraged off of those news sources and that existing context. Again, with a structured model prompt, you can send all this context to the LLM. And when you do so, don't try and reinvent the wheel, right? Go for a very established, a very basic, and a very sort of simple and understandable model. Something that only takes in a handful of inputs and outputs. And the goal here is really just to get some sort of basic model of a technology, maybe a cost, maybe scalability, OpEx or CapEx, just so you can get a ballpark, right? You're not going to be able to produce a highly accurate model just by asking an LLM with a handful of data sources that you've been able to provide. But you are going to be able to tell, hey, is this something that looks like it can actually achieve an interesting result? Is this a technology that has some potential if we can bring costs down? Or is this in the ballpark of something that we would care about? And you can also start to understand, hey, here's what we need to learn more about, right? We actually don't have enough information, or we're missing some crucial piece of information. And if we had that, it would really deepen our understanding of the potential economics of this technology. So you can quickly get an understanding, whether it's the economics or the scalability, or just an understanding of what you do know or what you don't know when you ask LLMs to build these models. And so as we walk through these examples, there's a few things I want to sort of call out. The first is that I think a lot of innovation teams are using LLMs like chatbots, right? And that's fine for day-to-day work, maybe drafting emails. But when you start to use LLMs programmatically, A, it makes the outputs more consistent, and that's nice. But B, it makes them a lot more useful over time because you're going from answering one-off questions to building consistently structured databases and resources and insights, right? And as you have those databases, as you're building that more consistent information pool and more consistent information architecture, that's what actually unlocks being able to do more complex or more difficult tasks with LLMs. And it actually enables these new use cases, right? There's a lot that you can do once you have all the right context and information. Without it, LLMs can often suggest a course of action, perhaps, but they can't really answer your questions. And the third thing I want to highlight is you don't necessarily need programming expertise. We're now at the points where I think LLMs can more or less write functioning code. And I think for a lot of innovation teams, the barrier to entry has really been reduced substantially to doing a lot of this type of analytical work compared to even just a few years ago. But you are going to need to work with your IT teams, right? If you're at a large company, I'm sure you're already thinking, wow, if I just started writing code, I would get a lot of angry emails and possibly phone calls from different people in my cybersecurity function, and that's fair enough. So strategically, you need to ask yourself, do we want to be on the cutting edge of leveraging these LLMs? Do we have that type of AI structure that we've talked about here at Lux in the past? And can we really start to build these applications out? Does it make sense for us to do it? Or should we wait? Because I think in the longer term vision, there are going to be platforms that allow you to do this a bit more easily, a bit more simply, and with no coding required at all, much more like a traditional software vendor. But that's going to take time to develop, right? So think a little bit strategically about your innovation function and your organization's overall level of AI acceptance, and ask yourself, what's the best way for us to bring some of these capabilities into our organization? And I want to also mention how Lux is really beginning to tackle this. And these examples I've been given, are not unfamiliar to us because they're things that we're exploring as well here at Lux. But I think the big thing I want to highlight is that we are really working to build kind of a proprietary intelligence layer. We have this really unique database here at Lux, and if you've read our research, not only is it sort of bold and opinionated and strategic, it actually goes back a long way. We have a 15, 20 years of a database now, vetting startups, analyzing technologies. There's a lot of really great material, and there's a lot of really great context in there. And so what we've done is we have integrated this with Copilot, right, as our first step. So our clients can validate assumptions, they can compare and vet sources, and they can do all of these different tasks that we've talked about, within that Copilot AI environment. I won't say too much about this. I'll just highlight that basically there's something called a model context protocol server. And essentially when you ask a question, that server then reaches out and connects to all these different databases, including, in this example, our database of research. And it pulls what's relevant and sends that along with your question to the large language model to get a response. Now, the easiest way to access this is through Copilot for Teams. You can just get a plugin, and it's quite easy to turn on. Shouldn't really require a ton of lift. But this MCP server is a piece of technology, right? And just like an LLM, it can be accessed through an API. So all of the example use cases I've talked about here today, they can be done through that more programmatic approach. That can actually be done through our server as well. So when you're analyzing the news, you can actually bring to bear all of the written context of all of the analysts who've worked at Lux through the LLM to actually analyze that news or analyze a company or brainstorm ideas. That whole sort of collective unconscious of our analysts is available not just through the written research, but also programmatically, right, through that API access. So I think in the long term, what we're really trying to build and the direction that I think we see innovation teams going is building these contextual databases and this contextual AI, right? And then not just using that as like a one-off way to answer questions, but really using it to automate and curate even more data information. And when you apply this sort of collective brain that we've built, you can actually really start to manage information at scale, sort through lots of information, identify what's important to you, and not miss those critical signals that you need, and which I think a lot of innovation leaders know are right now often not being seen. So I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts before I invite Greg and Ryan back on to answer some questions. The first thing I'd emphasize is that LLMs can curate information, but ultimately they don't reason, right? They don't think. They're large text autocompletes. They make probabilistic predictions about text. This is powerful, and it can do a lot of stuff, but it's no replacement for human reasoning. So when you focus on building information flows, you ultimately end up empowering the real smart people who work as your business, right? And at the same time, enabling more automation down the line. And I think both of those are really valuable outcomes. Second, as we've been sort of emphasizing, LLMs need context and style to produce better results. They're text predictors, so the text they're given impacts their output a lot. And if you can give them meaningful context and well-written research, in my view, it makes them even more powerful. And lastly, I think as innovation teams are being asked to do more with less, right, as I think has been really the trend over the last couple of years, if you can leverage LLMs at scale, you can really make your team a lot more powerful by giving them the information and the resources they need to make better decisions more quickly, right? But actually doing this kind of goes beyond just talking to the LLM. And I think there's this sense in which, a lot of people think, oh, text or chatting, that's the new internet. But I really think that there's going to be platforms, and there's going to be a platform layer built on top of this. And that is really going to be the new way in which innovation teams end up doing their business and end up leveraging LLMs. So with that, I want to say thanks. We have a lot more resources on this. You can follow and connect here. But I'll hand it back over to my colleague, Greg.
Well, very good. Thank you, Anthony. That was very insightful. Really appreciate the time and the presentation. We're going to open it up for questions now. So I see one already typed in. If you have questions, please add them to the chat and we will get through as many as we can. First question, Anthony says, can you explain the framework on slide 13 in a little more detail? What other applications have you used this with?
Good question. Ryan, maybe you want to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to take this one. So the framework, the kind of simple framework mental model that we put together has been a great tool in our conversations with clients to help them frame which use cases are genuinely good candidates for AI. And kind of equally as importantly, understanding how the human worker evolves in an AI world as we continue to move to the integration of these tools into what we do on a day in, day out basis. What does that mean for what we do as human workers at the end of the day? And so one of the big things where this really helps is with prioritization. And so thinking about what use cases are actually good candidates for AI versus what should really be focused on by that human worker, which is kind of that top right of the novel and hard problems versus what can kind of be automated away. And then what I think is equally important in this is reframing the whole conversation on what gets replaced to really where does that human value get concentrated and where do we really enable these human workers to do what they're best at and have AI free up that time to really focus on those hard, novel problems across organizations.
Very good. Thank you for that, Ryan. Two other questions. One that just came in. Let's see. What is Lux planning in the future in terms of AI or other capabilities?
Well,
Anthony,
yeah, I can say a few words about this, and then Greg, maybe you can say a few words as well.
Of course.
I think, first we are, I mentioned we're integrated with Copilot. Of course, we are planning to roll out to other LLM integrations just as soon as we can, and indeed very shortly. I think longer term, we're really thinking about how we can leverage both, the data that we have internally. So we have, for example, like I mentioned, 15 years of company profiles. And over the years, we've done large-scale data analysis on this. But it's always been a little bit limited, right? We score companies with our scorecard, but it's hard to reduce a company down to just 10 metrics, right? So we've done some very interesting work with that database. But I think going forward, one of the things I'm working on this year is how can we leverage this existing data in a lot more powerful ways with LLMs? Can we do large-scale linguistic analysis, for example, on our database of company profiles and pull out commonalities, themes in successful versus unsuccessful companies, right? How do we leverage other sources of publicly available information to continue to enrich what's on the member site? So there's a lot that I think now is possible for us now that we have these capabilities with LLMs. We've always had, I think we're kind of in a lucky position because at Lux, we've always had this really rich and interesting data, which we're generating by writing the research. And now it seems like the data analysis tools have finally caught up to that. Whereas I think a lot of LLMs are sort of looking for data, right? If I could say it that way. So we're kind of in an interesting position now. Greg, I'm
Thanks,
curious
Anthony.
your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll add a few other things there. We at Lux, just like our clients, are using LLMs, AI every day, just like you. I think what we're looking at very intensively and building technology around is how can we help you make better decisions, given the fact that we all have a new decision aid. We have more data. The other thing we're trying to help with is LLMs are amazing. I think all of us have experiences on probably a weekly basis where we're impressed that the LLM was able to understand context, make connections. The challenge is all the data that's fed into the LLM is essentially scraped from the internet, other than a few specialized areas where it's specifically trained, medical text, things like that. Most of the rest of it is just garnered from material that's out in the internet. Some of which is true, some of which isn't true. So we spent a lot of time in our platform, in the Copilot agent and other LLM agents to help you sift through when you're doing research to say, is it true, is it not true? So you can send research that you've done, questions you have, reports that you may have purchased from other vendors, and hand it to the Lux agent and get a human vetted review based on, as Anthony mentioned, the 15 years of research that we have there. Okay, I know we're coming down to the end. There's another question, Ryan. I think this will be for you, which is, I saw on slide 26, it looks like you have an agent, it says. Okay, it's typing back. Okay, so the question, Ryan, is there an actual agent for Copilot available today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have our Copilot agent available and working. We're using it internally quite a bit as well. And so with any interest in that or interested about learning more, I would welcome you to reach out and we can run you through some demos and talk about how to get you set up with that.
Very good. Okay. I think that is all that we will have time for today. I want to thank everybody for attending. Anthony, Ryan, thank you for your time in presenting insights. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any other further questions. If you'd like to take a look at any of the chat integrations like Copilot, etc., please reach out and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you very much, and everyone have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.